Mickey Bergman, it is great to have you on the podcast. I think you're going to find this interview a much more hospitable place than Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Russia, some of the places that you've been
Hope
to.
so. Sure hope so. Yeah.
I love the book. I love the perspective. I mean, even as a journalist for 2 decades that has been covering these issues, this is a side of the negotiations that take place to bring home Americans and bring home any hostage that the public never gets to see.
That is correct. They never get to see, typically, not because somebody's trying to hide it, but because it's so nuanced and complicated that this attention span is not there typically on the media side.
You describe, first of all, I agree with you 100%. We in the media have very short attention spans. We jump from thing to thing. We can't concentrate on many things at the same time. There's very little follow-up, but that's a separate podcast at some point. But your book, In the Shadows, you describe the high-stakes negotiations you've been involved in, whether it's Otto Warmbier, Brittany Griner, or a number of people that, folks who've been following headlines would be familiar with coming home in recent years. You call what you do fringe diplomacy. Explain what fringe diplomacy is, how governments, like the U.S. government, is limited in what it can do, and what people like you do.
Yeah, so yes, I call it fringe diplomacy, by the way. It's a term that I came up with sitting on the couch with my wife watching a TV show, a sci-fi TV show called Fringe, which dealt with fringe science. And I looked at my wife and I was like, oh my God, that's what I'm doing, just in diplomacy. I have a lot of people who think that the branding is terrible, but I like it. But fringe diplomacy really is the area that goes beyond what the authority and mandate of governments are in international relations, and it's based on the idea that individuals, private citizens, business people, academia, artists, NGOs, we all have similar interests to government in having a more peaceful, prosperous, and stable world. But unlike government, we are not constrained by specific policy or diplomatic kind of dances.
You don't have your own foreign policy.
Yeah, and the point, it's divided. I divided it into two kind of activities. The first one is engagement, and the second one is intervention. An intervention is when you, in my world, ends up being when you negotiate a release of a political prisoner or a hostage somewhere, and the interventions are quick, they're tangible, they're sexy. Wolf Blitzer does a special on you, which is fantastic. But the truth is that these interventions cannot succeed unless you have years of engagement and building relationships. And you don't do the engagements just for the sake of a future intervention. They need to be worthwhile in themselves. But nobody wants to hear about the engagements. That's the long-term relationship building, trust, working on different societal challenges in different countries. We've had this in Myanmar, we had this in Cuba, we had this in Lebanon over the years, in North Korea. That allows us, when there is a crisis, to actually step in with some familiarity and with some basic trust that allows us to really deal with some of the challenges that we have.
Peel back the layer here for people, because if you watch the news, you're generally familiar with the developments. On one side, you have Kim Jong-un. On the other side, you have the United States of America. On one side, you have Vladimir Putin. On the other side, you have the U.S. government. What's happening in between there? What's happening behind the scenes there? Because officially, there are no diplomatic relations, but ultimately, these sides have to talk to each other, and you're in between.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you'll be surprised. They don't always talk to each other. Even when they talk, the conversations are not very active, not proactive. But for example, when we worked, Danny Fenster is a Jewish journalist from Detroit that was taken in Burma, in Myanmar, after the coup, over the 3 months after the coup took place. There is a U.S. embassy in Myanmar, in Yangon, but by point of policy, they were not talking to the local government, because we didn't recognize the military government of Myanmar as a legitimate government. The U.S. didn't. If you don't talk with the government, how are you going to get your guy out? So that's an example of when the conversations don't happen. With the Iranians, there's no direct talks. There's indirect talks, and every now and then there'll be some covert talks, but it makes it really, really hard. You have to rely on somebody else to do it. But more than that, even let's say the Americans and the Russians say, hey, time to solve the problem of our mutual prisoners. Let's get together. we'll have a team of 5 Americans, 5 Russians. We'll meet in Istanbul to have a conversation about that. And they go in with the best intentions. Before they even say the first word, the weight of the war in Ukraine, the weight of nuclear instability or structural stability, the weight of world order, all the complexities of the relationships between two governments make it almost impossible for the government to insulate the issue of the prisoners on a strictly humanitarian thing and find a pathway to do it. Now, when we do this, because we do this not on behalf of the government, we do this on behalf of families. We don't work for the government.
So explain, let's back up. Explain who is we. When you say we do this, who are you?
We for 17 years and most of the book writing, it was Governor Bill Richardson and myself, called the Richardson Center for Global Engagement. We had advisors here and there. One of the common advisors that we had over the years is former Ambassador Cameron Hume, who was a colleague and friend of Governor Richardson for 40 years and now is a really close friend of mine. But that was it. And we do this, we're a non-profit, non-government organization. We do this at the request of families on their behalf at no cost to them. We raise our funds elsewhere. That means that when we go into these conversations, the only mandate we have is from the families. We don't have government authority. We don't talk on behalf of the government. But that means that when we sit in a similar thing with the Russians, for example, in my example from before, they can talk to me about Ukraine. They can talk to me about nuclear stability, and they do. But I have absolutely zero authority on policy. So I'm able to actually keep the conversation insulated on the issue of prisoners, and we're able to experiment because we get to know each other on a personal level, experiment with some ideas, figure out what a pathway to getting somebody home is, define it, and then I don't have authority, so I need to go and try and sell that to my own government as well.
Yeah, so you're working both sides. You're working the State Department, you're working U.S. officials, you're also working, these various regimes. You write in the book, to be successful, we need to get inside the head of some of the world's most infamous leaders. Explain what that means and how you do that.
So I have, it's one of the things hopefully the book, I hope that when people think about this book or hear about it, they don't, I don't need another policy book. I don't need another book about national interest. It's not about that. We actually talk very little about national interest and high-level diplomacy. It's not,
you take us on the road with you around the world a few times.
Yeah, but it's about people. And that's my thing on this, is that international relations, yes, national interests are a big part of the game, but they're not the only part of the game. And we forget that. We forget at the end of the day, we're dealing with people, whether it's the leaders of countries or the people working for them. And for each of these people, there is a life story there. And nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, oh, I'm evil. Let me see what evil I can do in the world. There is a certain way that they perceive the world and their role in it that explains what they do. And it's important to understand. Explains, doesn't justify. Because when I get into their heads, I don't justify their activities. I don't absolve them of their responsibility for some pretty bad things that they are responsible for. But my job is to understand why they do this, how they think about the world, and how do they think about themselves, because that allows me to understand how they will react to different things and how I can actually get tangible things from them when we have things in common, like issues of prisoners. So that means I get to listen to their speeches, listen to their interviews, less about the arguments they're making, but more about their personalities, and figure out what is it in it that we can connect with? How do we scratch the surface deep enough to find the common humanity in order to actually get them to do what we want them to do?
Yeah, you talk about empathizing, not sympathizing.
Yes. And it's
a major difference there.
It's a key component, because empathizing is really getting into somebody else's shoes, as I said, like understanding the world the way they do, understanding the role that they have in it, and therefore understanding what they will do and what they need. Sympathy is when you do that and you start aligning your objectives with theirs. And I write about it. It's in my field. Empathy is a must. It's a necessity. You have to do it. And sympathy is a trap, But here's the thing with this, Mosh. When people are not used to exercising empathy, they conflate the two. And so if they hear somebody empathizing with somebody that they disagree with, they think, oh, that guy agreed. They're justifying bad things.
Right, especially in this black and white world that we live in.
Exactly.
You're the other,
and we
you're
need
with the
to
other
break
side.
that. And yes, I bring in, and I hope that that's the case. I bring people, hopefully people will read the book because they want to hear what happened with Brittany Griner. They want to hear what happened with Otto Warmbier, the kind of that story. But if my book's contribution is that we realize that issue of empathy and sympathy, and we realize that it's true about high stakes negotiations, it's also true about our neighbors from the other political side of the aisle. It's true about our crazy uncle that we disagree with, or the people at work. If we understand that that is something that we need to break, it's not black and white. It's empathy, understanding what people are coming from, because again, we are so quick to demonize somebody else, to say they're crazy, they're irrational, and then we can't have a common language between them. At the end of the day, even if it's, if you're a Democrat and you have a Republican with you, Trump versus Biden, Hillary Clinton versus Trump, like all of these kind of dichotomies that we have, at the end of the day, nobody's evil here. People do things out of the way that they see the world, out of fear. We need to deeply understand that and be empathetic, even if we're not sympathetic to it.
Important words, especially domestically here in the U.S., as we start to see our political opponents like enemies, even though they're our neighbors. There's this idea out there that some leaders in this world are irrational. They're not rational actors. I mean, you're dealing with people who are accused of that all the time, the North Koreans, the Iranians, Putin. It's quite the opposite as you write it. You're talking about your negotiations with Javad Zarif and the Iranians. These are very rational actors. What's the perception? What do people need to know about dealing with these types of regimes, given how they're portrayed sometimes as irrational, evil, etc.?
Yeah, and look, I'll take it to the extreme now, because even though I don't write, the book was concluded before October 7th and the war in Gaza and the hostage crisis that we have there, even Hamas is rational.
Right.
But we need to understand what goes into their calculations, into their rational box.
Yeah, there was actually a testimony as we record this week. A State Department official was on Capitol Hill and was asked about the state of the ceasefire. And as Barbara Leaf is her name, she works under Tony Blinken.
Correct.
And she said, the issue we have is there's a guy underground in Gaza who's a psychopath, messianic in his viewpoints. And that's the trouble we're having.
Well, he might be messianic, but that doesn't make him irrational. Again, we need to understand the ideology and what he stands for. But statements like that, and Barbara Leaf is a fantastic diplomat, by the way. She's the Assistant Secretary of State for Nearest Affairs. But that kind of language doesn't help us.
Calling Sinwar a psychopath doesn't help?
It doesn't help us. Yeah, it's just like Little Rocket Man didn't help us deal with Kim Jong-un when Trump called him that. Back. And then he switched into love letters. None of this is helpful. Not the I love you to the you're irrational. Look, Sinwar has he has a very different life or values to life, or he values life differently. One of the things that it makes it really hard to negotiate with Hamas is because their best alternative to a negotiated agreement is hostages can die. Even Palestinian civilians can die. Now, it's a reality. It's not something we can change. It doesn't make him crazy, because there's within his mind and the way he sees his role and his world, those things actually help with his agenda. And so we need to realize where we are, what influences we do have and we can have, and what kind of deal we can have with somebody like Sinwar. And calling him a psychopath is not going to help that.
They're all rational, even if they do terrible things, and you don't, endorse their worldview, any segment of it. And since you brought, since we're talking about him now, you were talking about the exchange that actually freed him, the exchange for Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, where the Israelis gave more than 1,000 Palestinians, including Yahya Sinwar, who would go on to mastermind October 7th and is the person we're dealing with today. The pushback oftentimes, and you see it happening with this ongoing negotiation, is you're conceding to terror, you are helping authoritarians. You're incentivizing more of this hostage taking, whether it's giving back an arms dealer in exchange for Brittany Griner, or giving back hundreds or thousands of prisoners to Hamas in exchange for Israelis.
Yep.
What's your response to that? The sort of the criticism that these negotiations get.
Yeah, I'll say a few things, and this is very valid, and it's a heavy thing. The first thing I'll say, by the way, in this kind of world, and it's not only my world, but it's our world, values clash. There isn't a silver bullet of how you do something that is absolutely right and nothing is wrong. Again, the world is also, just like people, the world is not divided to black and white, good and evil. It's complicated. But here's the thing on the argument of that we're incentivizing by making these deals. There's two elements of it that argument fails. One, it's intellectually lazy. And second, it's morally bankrupt, and I'll explain why I said, because I know it's a strong statement. They're intellectually lazy. It's because it's actually not based on any data. There's very few researchers and data that have been done on this area of political prisoners and hostages. One of them is done by a guy named Brian Jenkins, who's a 50-year veteran of counterterrorism in the United States, an expert, fantastic guy, lives in California. He did that study for Rand Corporation. He accumulated over 20 years of data and did it over time to try and find a correlation between the way these cases are resolved and what the impact of that on other cases. And he found absolutely complete ambiguity between the way these cases are resolved and the number of Americans or other hostages being taken after. It's not that if we solve these, if we negotiate, the number goes down. It's not that it goes up. It's just completely, there's no correlation between it. That's the part on the intellectual part of it. Now, the moral bankruptcy is where I feel very passionate about it. Often you argue we do need to have deterrence. We do need to figure out how we fix this problem. If we can't even eliminate it, at least limit it, mitigate it. But arguing for deterrence on the back of those who are being taken or held is morally corrupt and bankrupt, because deterrence needs to happen when they come back. The first thing we need to do is do everything in our power. These are our own people that are being held because they're our own people, not because they did something. Either it's Americans abroad because they have a blue passport, or whether it's in Gaza, Israelis that they were citizens being held because they're Israeli. We need to do what we have to do in order to get them back. And those deals are never pretty. They stink. They absolutely stink. I'll be the first one to admit it. Releasing Victor Bout, a 14-year in prison here arms dealer, known in the United States as a merchant of death, in return for Brittany Griner, an innocent Olympian champion basketball player, is extremely unfair. It's not just, it stinks. But instead of focusing on the criminal that we're releasing, if we flip it around and we focus on the innocent American that we're saving over this, my argument is that the United States is strong enough to absorb the cost of Victor Bout, and it's a calculated
even if his future behavior
risk
leads to future death and destruction.
Well, there are arguments and ways of mitigating that. So specifically for Victor Bout, he's been here for 14 years. If anybody thinks that Victor Bout is going to go into arms dealing again, and even if he wants to, that anybody in the field will trust him after being 14 years in American custody, they don't understand the dynamics
illegal arms trading. But I guess the argument.
Yeah, unfortunately for me, I learned to think like a terrorist, a part of my work. But let me just finish one more thing, because this is because I was involved and I write about it in the Gilad Shalit negotiations. I didn't like the deal, but it was the only deal that could bring the Gilad Shalit home, and therefore that was the deal that had to make. My thing is, the problem was not with the deal. And yes, the price was extraordinary. 1,100 prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, for one Israeli soldier.
Including Sinwar, who would go on to kill and start this war.
Including Sinwar, who was released and then became the head of Hamas. The problem was not the deal. The problem was what Israel didn't do after the deal was completed. And that's where I get to my point on deterrence. We do what we need to do to bring them home. Then it is our responsibility when our people are home to deploy deterrence. And there were opportunities over the years, not only for Sinwar, he happened to end up growing to be the head of Hamas, but there were opportunities, we know that, it's public, to bring them back to put them back to justice, either to take them out if you can't, if it's Israel, or bring them back to court. And there was a political decision in Israel not to do it. Now, Israel has been, in the past, the global example of how you appoint an intelligence unit, and you say, we don't care if it takes 20 years. Every single person involved in this will be brought to justice or taken out.
Right, Munich
Munich is a great example for that. And even if you don't get everybody involved knows that when they mess up with an Israeli, they have a target on their heads for the rest of their lives. Now, that's when you do deterrence. It doesn't stop it, but it mitigates that thing. Same goes, I argue, with Americans being held as political prisoners, sanctions are irrelevant for this, because if you look at the countries that take Americans, they're typically maxed already on sanctions. What, you slap in another sanction on Iran? They have thousands of them already.
Right. It's a joke when they, like, I think we recently announced even more sanctions on Russia, and I was like, I didn't know any more left.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the judge, the prison guard that wronged them, they trade with the United States. That's really going to impact them. But if you actually find a few examples like that of people who have wronged Americans and you indict them, for example, in American courts, and now you put a red notice. They would never accept the jurisdiction, but you put a red notice on them, which means that they can be extradited when they travel. At that point, you're starting to actually change regular people's life, like a judge. A judge in Myanmar can't go to Thailand on vacation with his family because there might be a red notice on them and they might get arrested. Now, that's a tool that we haven't really used. And I'm not sure why. I mean, I'm working on it on a commission and trying to figure out how we can do this. Again, there's a lot of backfire in it, because as you do that, you can imagine that Americans will be put that way by other countries as well. But if we're serious about solving this problem, we need to take some serious measures. And that means that once you indict somebody who has wronged an American, and you can't do it everywhere, but once you have the opportunity and you actually go and send somebody to pick him up, to extract that person and bring him to a trial in the United States, now you're sending a message. Maybe not to the leaders of the countries, but you're sending a message to the judges, to the jail guards. So even if there's American being held, they're going to think a couple of times of how they treat them.
Though, in the example of Russia, since Brittany Griner, we got Evan Gershkovich is there, and then there's Ksenia Karolina, another American.
There are. Everybody knows about Paul Whelan, of course, Evan Gershkovich. Also, there are at least 6 more cases of Americans, including.
I mean, it sounds like Putin knows this is a good tactic for him. If I'm pushing back, and by the way, Vladimir Putin is not somebody who you indict in a U.S. court and he cares.
That is correct. By the way, I thought you said it will be more hospitable here than no. Who's
more hospitable, the Iranian foreign minister or me? So far, it's been 20 minutes.
Well, the Iranian former foreign minister, is a charming guy. I actually, on a personal level, again, I disagree with everything, and I don't absolve him on things that he's responsible for. But on a personal level, he's a charming and really nice guy. Yeah. But going back to Putin, here's my counter argument to what she said. So before there was Brittany Griner, and before there was Trevor Reed, there was Paul Whelan. And when Paul Whelan was taken, we started working on behalf of his family, and we had a whole bunch, I described it in the book, little exchanges of confidence boosters between us and the Russians on medical stuff between him and a Russian prisoner that was in the United States. And at some point, the pandemic hit, and we went to the Russians and said, okay, let's cut to the chase here. Let's come to the end of this. And we got kind of a nod, wink from them that if we released this Konstantin Yeroshenko, who was a drug pilot that was arrested in Liberia but served his time in Connecticut, if we release him, they will reciprocate with a humanitarian release of Paul Whelan. We brought it to the White House. That was the Trump administration. There was just no interest. Not because Donald Trump didn't want to bring Americans home. He just didn't want to appear as if he's doing something in return for that. So the approach was a little bit off for him. But having said that, the Americans did not negotiate. So what did the Russians do? They picked Trevor Reed. This time they went for a former Marine who was a former presidential guard in Camp David. So they upped the ante. It's the counter to the argument, oh, when we negotiate, we incentivize. Apparently, when we don't negotiate, we also incentivize. And so they upped the ante. And with Trevor Reed, of course, we were negotiating and working on behalf of his family, and we had some solutions, and we brought it at this point, it was the Biden administration. But also, from the Russian perspective, negotiations were not taking place. So guess what they did? They picked up Brittany Griner. And Putin knows us really well. He knows our society. He knows what strings to pull. So he picked up an Olympian champion, a black gay woman who's a symbol here in the United States. Oh, and guess who was negotiating after that? And so that was, and we were engaged in the Trevor Reed. There was a weird overlap when we were in Moscow negotiating for Trevor Reed and Paul Whelan. We didn't know that Brittany Griner was even taken, even though she was already in custody, because the White House wouldn't share and the family wouldn't share because they didn't want to make a big story out of it at that point.
Yeah.
But the Russians did take Brittany Griner before real negotiations over Trevor Reed took place. So I can create a narrative that says when you don't negotiate, you put at risk more Americans. And then,
so is that what Gershkovich is about?
So I follow that line. You're jumping ahead of me here, but yes,
yeah.
Because it's great. Because Brittany Griner came back, and we thought, okay, we still have Paul Whelan. Paul Whelan was left behind in my count 4 times, which is devastating because it's a failure of mine. But Paul Whelan's still there, and then negotiations stopped. So what do? Let's pick up a journalist here. Let's pick up Evan Gershowitz. And so you have that kind of dynamic, and we're, right now we're kind of in a place where we're a little bit stuck, at least from the administration's perspective. We know what Putin wants, by the way. There is a deal that Putin wants. It's really not pretty. Those deals never get prettier as we progress on those things.
When you say not pretty, meaning the people he wants released?
Correct.
Yeah.
But there's something more with Putin. It's not only the people that he wants, but he also doesn't want to make Biden look good in an election year. So the assumption can be, I don't accept it, but the assumption can be.
Why? Because Putin wants Trump back.
Yes. And so the assumption might be, there's nothing we can do between now and the elections. After the elections, no matter who wins, there will be a new window in which negotiations can ensue. Here's the thing with it. I know 2 cardinal truths about these negotiations, doing it for 18 years. The first one is the deals never get better over time. We can tell ourselves stories about it, and narratives and spin it, but they actually never get better over time. And the second part is that time is terrible for the hostages. Now, we know that for a fact in Gaza, but it's true about Venezuela. It's true about Russia, because any given day, something terrible can happen, a disease, an attack, a breakdown mentally that somebody actually attempts their own lives. So there's an urgency for it. So for me to say, I guess we can't do anything for 5 months, that's not enough. So it might be true that we can't do anything for the next 5 months, but hell, I'm not going to sit back and wait. So we're coming up with all sorts of ideas and all sorts of solutions and propositions of how we can solve that and bring them home before the elections. We might be wrong and it can't be done, but damn, we're going to try.
Explain Vladimir Putin a little bit, because I think there's a lot of people who try to understand or try to explain his actions in Ukraine, etc. What have you learned about him and his goals?
So there's the personal part about him, and then there's the more his view of the world and how he says it. And there is a narrative for Putin there. And I've learned that just by visiting Russia and talking. I haven't met him. I have to be transparent about it. But I met the people who are close to him, and they convey those messages and that narrative. The first thing is kind of known. The Russians view the history of the United States as one of really one-sided approach to us. When they look at World War II, for example, they would argue, guys, you in the West, the Americans and the Europeans, you could not have won that war without the Russians and the Russian sacrifice that we've made. They've lost 28 million Russians in that war. Now, objectively, they're probably right. The the West would not have been able to win against the Nazis without the Russians' front in the East and the sacrifice that they've made. It's also true the other way around. The Russians would not have been able to win without us, going from the west side of this. But, and that's what the Russians' argument is, all we celebrate and all we commemorate is the Normandy invasion, landing, and the Western liberation of the camps. And they're right about that. There's no acknowledgement of the Russian sacrifice, never in our history, in our narrative. So it's kind of like a chip on their shoulder of something that they're holding resentful.
Right, because we went straight into the Cold War and we were not in the business of boosting the Russians.
That is correct. And now what I've learned over the last couple of years is that Putin actually got into the next level of the way he explains this. Because one of the things, okay, let's say you accept what I just said about World War II and kind of that feeling of resentment or lack of acknowledgement. There is a question that the Russians had to cope with, including Putin himself, who was a KGB officer at the time that the Cold War ended. And that is, why did they lose the Cold War? And up to recent years, the argument would have been either that their system is inferior to our system, to the liberal democracy of the West, or that they themselves as people are inferior. Neither of those are something that people want to hear or accept. And Putin came in and said something very interesting. He said, no, it's not that our system was inferior. And I'm telling you, my Russian fellows, it's not that we are inferior. We're not inferior. It's just we started the Cold War with a deficit of 28 million people, not just people, the engine of our economy, the young men. These were the 28 million. They were supposed to drive us. And throughout the duration of the Cold War, the West did everything in their power to make sure that we can't catch up on this. Now, whether that is correct or not, irrelevant for my perspective. What is relevant is to realize that you're a Russian citizen and you hold that kind of humiliation and that suddenly there is an explanation for why it's not your fault, for why you're not worse than anybody else, you're as good as everybody else. That resonates so well, and it explains why Putin has a really strong hold on the population despite the hardships in Russia since he came to power. And if you understand that, and if I'm right, and again, I might be completely wrong, but this is the things that I got. There's little things that you can do. For example, when I went to Moscow for the negotiations, the first thing we did in the Red Square, the governor and I, we went to the tomb of the unknown soldier, the Russian, not the American, and paid respects over there. We didn't say anything, but we physically went there. And again, by the way, it's genuine. It's not because we're faking.
But you also know you're being watched, and you want to be able.
You know you're being watched, but it's important for me to say that it's actually genuine, because I do agree to the fact that these Russian soldiers who died in World War II helped save our people.
They liberated camps too.
Correct. So this is just like a little thing, but there's a bigger thing. If I knew what I knew, or I believe what I know about this, and then I'm advising President Biden on the eve of the war in Ukraine, when he gave the big speech. I think it was February 22nd. So 2 days before the war in Ukraine, he gave a speech out of the White House. And the speech was very like, who in God's name made Putin, the decider of sovereignty and borders. If I'm advising Biden at that point, knowing what I know about the Russian narrative, I say, instead of that, why don't you go into the cameras and start differently and say, I'm going to talk to the American people here in a minute. But before I do, I want to talk to the Russian people. You and us, we fought shoulder to shoulder against Nazism in World War II. We would not have been able to win that war without you. You would not have been able to win that war without us. We owe this to each other. Let's not make a huge mistake here. And then he can turn to the American people and continue the same speech that he gave about the invasion to Ukraine is bad and sanctions and all of that stuff.
And you feel with 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border that may have changed Putin's mind?
It probably would not have changed Putin's mind at all. Putin is playing a chess game here on world order. But could that have put a dent into the narrative that we are not acknowledging them, that anger, that chip, and that resentment? Could that have changed over time, planted a seed in which we can actually work more collaboratively and figure out what it is. Now, for Putin himself, and this is what I said, I started with the Russian narrative, the larger Russian narrative. Putin himself, in terms of my assessment, look, he suffered, he sees the loss of the Cold War as a personal humiliation. And it's his life goal and his legacy piece to bring back the world from a unipolar world in which the United States is a superpower back into at least a multipolar world, if not a bipolar world, in which the Russians and the Americans and NATO are toe to toe. Now, it doesn't add up on the GDP. It doesn't add up on anything else. But if you're thinking from that perspective, we look at Ukraine, at the war in Ukraine, and say, hey, look at that. The mighty Russian army could not defeat little Ukraine. Putin looks at it, it's like, no. The mighty American and NATO alliance could not defeat the Russian military in Ukraine. Toe to toe.
Because he's defining victory differently. Victory for him wasn't taking the whole country.
And we look at Ukraine as this game of checkers, and look, the president has been playing a pretty damn good game of checkers there. You know, Kiev hasn't fallen. There's been a pushback. It goes back and forth and all of these things. But Putin is not famous for being a checkers player. He's a famous chess player. So is it possible that Ukraine is not really the entire board game? The entire board game is world order, because he wants to bring that. And that's what I kept hearing when I meet with the Russians. Like, let us tell you what's happening now. The world is being recarved into spheres of influence. And
he's also trying to we already saw it with the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan. We saw it post 9/11. We saw 20 years of war and the toll it's taken here in America. We see the rise of populism here in America, make America great again, etc. Yeah. He's trying to exhaust American will to be involved around the world.
And he knows us so well, because he knows we go through these cycles. Before World War II, we're isolationist until Pearl Harbor happened to us. And we realized that we can't be.
Yeah, we let the Nazis almost 2 years. More than 2 years do their thing.
And so he knows us, and he knows the politics of us. He knows us extremely well. He studied. Look, he's an agent. He is an expert in what I strive to be an expert, emotional intelligence. He just uses it for different reasons, for different causes. But that's something that is again, it's so important. And by the way, here's a statement that will shock people but then they realize that they think about it. When we're looking at a triangle, if we are looking at a triangle, U.S. and NATO, Russia and China.
Yeah.
Okay, let's say this is the new world order. I'm not sure that it is, because I think
Putin would love to be on that line. I don't know if he gets a whole line of the triangle, but
and I was going to say, I think that the Saudis leading the Gulf states think of themselves also as another pillar in this. So we might be looking at the four-way game here. But if it's only three of us, Russia, China, and the US, then historically speaking, the Americans and the West is way closer to the Russians than we are to the Chinese. And the Russians are closer to us, culturally speaking, than they are to the Chinese. So if you had, take a time now, jump 20 years forward, let's say we solve the issue of Ukraine and we're still in a tripolar world kind of thing, in all likelihood, the Americans and the Russians are not going to be best friends, but they're going to collaborate more than not and be in competition with the Chinese. But we're in a different dynamic right now, and it's a question of how do we get beyond that. But that's a question that I think that if I'm Putin, I'm concerned about that, because if the U.S. understands that that's a dynamic, now we're looking at, if we're the balance of power kind of dynamic in the world now, we should be looking at the areas where Russia and China have disagreements. Myanmar is one of them. North Korea might be another one. There's a lot of areas, Latin America, there's a lot, Africa, and play in that, because we need to carve the areas where we collaborate and compete with each of them, instead of what we're doing, which is leaving a vacuum.
Leaving and then threatening the Chinese not to help Vlad out.
Correct.
I love in the book, I mean, and people hear it in just the conversation we had about Vladimir Putin, is you try to get inside the minds of these various countries. I found it interesting the joke you told about getting inside the minds of the North Koreans, the way the North Koreans see the world. And in fact, very similar to the Israelis. While there are worlds of difference between Israel and North Korea.
Hey, don't get me canceled. Let me verify here. I'm not comparing. I'm not saying that the Israelis are like the North Koreans, but I am doing a comparison in terms of the mindset.
Of the psyche, the mindset. And I think it's important that, you start with number one, the world is out to get us. Number two, we're surrounded by enemies. And number three, in order to deal with that, we need an asymmetric threat, which, by the way, I would throw the Iranians in there. If you look at a map today of where U.S. bases are, I always try to do this for my audience, Mickey, is like, okay, we're talking about from the U.S. Western perspective, flip it. If you're Vladimir Putin, look at the border of NATO today, right? If you're Iran, look at where all the U.S. bases are surrounding you today. If you're North Korea, look around you. And that's what you try to get at, is like, get inside their mind and look through their glasses, again, not to defend them, but to better understand their philosophy so you can negotiate with them.
And a very tangible example, and you're absolutely right, and thank you for bringing it, but let's see the U.S. Joint military exercises with the South Koreans. It starts in the South every year in the spring, and it starts creeping toward the exercise. The way it rolls out, it creeps towards the north. Now, two problems with that. The first one, when it creeps towards the north, and you're North Korea.
When you say creep to the north, you're talking about on the water near the Korean Peninsula.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. But it moves. The forces are moving constantly from the south towards the north, towards North Korea. Now, it's an exercise. It's not an invasion.
Right.
But if you're the North Korean and you believe that essentially the objective of the United States is to remove them from power. And
right, you live in this world of paranoia.
Then that means that every year when there's an exercise like that, you need all of your forces in highest alert. You believe that this is the year that the Americans are going to invade. That's the psyche of this. And that's a major problem that can be, it's not inevitable. It's an exercise. We can switch it around. We can start from the north and creep to the south, reducing their anxiety about it. But we choose not to. And the second thing, and that might sound silly because people don't think about it, it's always in the spring. It's in the time, or late winter, sorry. It's the time that the North Koreans are supposed to plant all of their agriculture stuff. And in a society like North Korea, the military helps the farmers in that time, but they can't when they're on highest alert. So the North Koreans are seeing it as if it's intentional on two fronts by the Americans.
Is it?
The design of it, and then the timing of it, I have to say, I think it is. Because when we recommended, hey, can you switch it as a gesture just this year? No.
I want to get at the question of media coverage. This came up a lot during the Brittany Griner stuff when the family wasn't speaking out and then was speaking out. To what extent does media coverage help negotiations? To what extent does it not help negotiations? Do you prefer other times where you're like, I wish there was no media coverage of this because we're at a very sensitive point here? How do you utilize media, and where does media become a challenge for you? Explain that dynamic as you engage in these very high stakes negotiations.
Yeah, I'll attack it from two sides. The first one, when it comes to families, and that's important because I work with families a lot. The instinct of government is always to tell the family, stay quiet, don't make a big story out of it because you'll increase the price.
You disagree with that? So the State Department saying, guys, no interviews.
Yeah, I disagree with the argument that it increases the price because by that time the captors know exactly who they have. Second, the captors don't care what the family says. There's nothing that a family will say that will convince Vladimir Putin to release their loved one or to punish them more. They're the family. He's expecting them to go nuts over this. He cares what the government says. It's not about the individual. It's about extracting some concession from a government. So I try to unburden the families from the fear because they're being told that if you say something, they can turn it around. It's like, no, they don't care what you say. They care what the government says. So therefore, when we talk to families about communications and media and public campaigns on this, we say there's only one target and one objective for you when you do that, and that is our own government. That's the audience. It's not the foreign governments. It's your government. So everything media is a means to an end. It's not a the purpose is not for family to be on Jake Tapper or Margaret Brennan. The objective is to bring somebody home. So if you feel like the U.S. government is in the process of doing the right thing and it's going the right direction, you sit back a little bit more publicly. You don't bother that. But if you feel like things are stagnated and you want to push them, your own government, then you go on the media and you do it in a very specific way. So I'll give you an example on Brittany Griner, because we worked extremely closely with Brittany's wife, Sherelle, and with her agent, Lindsay. And Lindsay was the one, she was like, I describe her in the book, like a conductor of an orchestra, because she knew her client could get public attention in the US whenever she wanted to. So she was playing all the different instruments, the different communities, the different constituencies, keeping up the volume in the right way. She knew she can get Sherelle, Brittany's wife, in front of the president as soon as she needed it. But there was no point in getting in front of the president before there was a deal on the table. So they took a back seat a little bit. Again, it's not about it's Brittany Griner, but she didn't push for a meeting with the president. She just garnered that public support and kept it at bay. Mm-hmm. And then in September, we knew that we're going to go. And I called her. It's like, you should make sure that Sherelle is sitting with the president on this date, because 2 days before we will be in Moscow. We're expecting to come back from Moscow with a proposition. And that will be the time to meet with the president, because when you meet with the president looks at his team and says, guys, where are we at that? Can I get a decision memo? And you want that decision memo to have an option. You don't want to, hey, we're stuck. The Russians are not doing anything. So that's the way we deal with it when it comes to families. Now, the other part of it, when it comes to the actual negotiations, how I wish it could be much more discreet. And I'll give you an example now. We've been for the last 6 months since in Gaza, we had a really successful first 50-something days of getting 109 people back.
Right. There was that massive exchange in November.
Yeah, correct. And since then, I can tell you, since December 20th, the same proposal that is currently on the table that we're still talking about, those stages, was available in December. And for 6 months, we've failed to bring that to a conclusion. And even when President Biden made public what he referred to as Bibi's plan, the one that Bibi told him.
Right, this was a few Fridays ago.
A few Fridays ago, that's correct. Bibi Netanyahu, from that point, was talking about it publicly. Now, if you want negotiations to succeed, you publicly talk about what is in common and privately deal with the gaps. And there are major gaps. But if you don't want negotiations to succeed, you publicly speak about the gaps because you rally up the sides, everybody's climbing on a tree. And that's what's been happening. And so it's should be an indicator of the fact that the current Prime Minister of Israel is not really, he doesn't see this deal as something that is viable for him or for Israel, which is something that we need to work really hard to change, because I do think it is viable to Israel. I think and I'll say that.
There's been a very public campaign, though, in recent weeks to lay blame, including the Americans, lay blame on Hamas here for not agreeing to the deal.
Correct.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, by the way. The only reason why we have hostages in Gaza is because Hamas took them and are holding them. There should be no doubt about that. But I can't expect Hamas to release them, but I can expect the Israeli Prime Minister to do everything in his power to get them out. And so the framing of it is really important, because it's important for people to remember, especially since we get really confused since October 7th from what is really happening here. So I think there's important clarifications over there. And I can tell you, like, there's two sides in here. There's Yahya Sinwar and there's Bibi Netanyahu. And I'm not comparing the two of them. One is the head of a state, one is the head of a terrorist organization. And both of them have very complicated set of interests that they're trying to play out in this. And it's true in my position that the proposition that is currently on the table, Hamas is one, not Bibi's proposition. Hamas is one that there's nothing in it that is existentially threatening the state of Israel. Again, it's not a pretty deal. It's a really hard one to swallow.
Meaning Israel has to get out. Israel has to release a untold number of prisoners.
Correct. Yeah. Well, untold. It's going to be in the thousands. We know what it. Yeah. We know more or less what it is. It's really, really hard to swallow that. But it's not existentially threatening the state of Israel. Therefore, I believe that the state of Israel can is strong enough to do it, to bring as many of our hostages back home, to unburden Israel from that weight, and then it can actually make its own decisions over time, what is right for it and what is wrong. And people say, well, but you're signing an agreement with Hamas. Yeah, I'm signing an agreement with Hamas. If anybody has any illusion that Hamas is going to keep to a deal over time, I have some bridge to sell them. It's that's not a reality. And the truth is, it's not exactly an honorable organization that you're making a deal with. You need to do what you need to do to get your people home, and then figure out how to work it from there. And again, I go back to what we talked about before. Bibi Netanyahu, who I obviously from this note, I disagree with him. He doesn't represent my positions. He did do something very smart, which I think is correct. After October 7th, he already commissioned, budgeted, and sealed the authorization for a specific intelligence agency and a unit to go and find everybody who's been responsible and involved in October 7th and bring them to justice or take them out.
This is like the Munich-like scenario, and then also the post-World War II Eichmann scenario, which is we will find you everywhere in the world.
Yeah, that has already been signed and sealed, and it's not revocable. He did it in that way. So even if he signs an agreement and we do that and we end the war, which I think for Israel's perspective and for Palestinians and I think for the United States, it is time to end this war. Yeah. Even if we end the war, it doesn't mean that you sign immunity now to everybody who's been involved in it. No. And I would argue even more so, getting Sinwar is going to be easier when there's not a war.
And ultimately, if you have to release certain people that you're not happy you're released, you do have an opportunity as Israel to go after them again and recapture them.
And now, and last thing I'll say about it, if you're President Biden, and you've tried really hard, and he has tried really, really hard to get this deal going, and after almost 9 months, it's not happening. He also has a responsibility to his own citizens, and there's still 8 of them being held.
How is it that the most powerful country on earth still has? Thailand struck a deal pretty early to get their people out. Why are there still Americans in Gaza in June?
Well, because it is extremely difficult for the President of the United States to strike a deal for the American hostages without the Israelis. And I agreed with that because the whole process of this makes sense. The Americans were trying to help through our mediators, through Qatar, through Egypt, to get all of the hostages back home, not to prioritize Americans. And that makes perfect sense until you realize that this is not going anywhere, and now you have an agenda. And I do think there is a way for the United States to push indirectly on a humanitarian track that can get the Americans back home, not to spite Israel, but actually as a way to show that it's possible and a way to open the door. And I really hope that that's what's going to happen. I mean, I really hope that we'll get a deal and everybody comes home. Yeah. But short of that, I hope that we don't just sit and wait for fear that this will look like it's a betrayal, but actually see it as something that is helpful, and we're going to pursue it.
This is probably the most prominent hostage taking we've seen. You've studied this stuff in a long time. What's the impact of October 7th, the 250 hostages taken, on overall terror tactics, overall global tactics? I mean, as somebody who does what you do.
Yeah, the truth is, I don't have a good answer for that. Number-wise, we've seen Boko Haram in Nigeria taking 250 girls. Right. So we've seen something like that, but we haven't seen it in this magnitude under conditions of war. And in that kind of environment. And so it's uncharted territories. And I've been doing this for 18 years. I admitted to the families that I work with on Gaza, and I work with dozens of them. And I had to admit, it's like, look, I've been doing it for 18 years. I've never dealt with something like that. It's uncharted waters. We're all going to try and figure it out as we go. So I don't have an answer. I don't know how it will impact this. It might be an anomaly over time, and we'll see it as a one-time blurb. Right now, it's throwing all the statistics and all the data completely off the rocker on this, so we can't really assess it yet.
Mickey Bergman, thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your work. The book is In the Shadows, and everyone should get it wherever they get their books.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.